for inviting me to speak on this topic and for that really nice and wonderful introduction. I hope everyone attending finds this content interesting, useful, and most importantly, actionable. As Kiara noted, my company is called Mighty Bytes. We've been around since 1998, and our purpose has been to help mission-driven organizations use the internet to create success. So we have a mission similar to TechSoup, it sounds like, only we do it a little bit differently in that we build digital products and services for our clients, so websites and that kind of thing. We do work with a lot of nonprofits and social enterprises, as well as other B Corps and associations, educational institutions. Basically, if you fall under the umbrella of a purpose-driven organization, we're more than happy to talk about working with you. And we've focused on this digital sustainability work since about 2012, which I'll talk a little bit about later. As Kiara also noted, we've been a B Corp since 2011, and really being a B Corp and going through the B Corp assessment is what drove us to really dig into this digital sustainability stuff deeper. If you're not familiar with B Corps, they're companies that use business as a force for good. They do that through a rigorous third-party certification process. There's about 6,500 B Corps around the world, and the community's collective long-term goal is shared prosperity and building a regenerative, inclusive economy. And as a digital agency, we've been around for about 25 years, so we've seen, the internet is how we make a living, and we've seen all the crazy problems that it's had, and they seem to have increased in frequency and in scale over the past few years, especially. And so I just want to go through some of the kind of big problems that the internet has. As nonprofits, you all use the internet every day, I'm sure, to market your services, to drive donations, to run volunteer programs, all that kind of stuff. So let's just talk about some of the challenges that some of the bigger challenges that the internet has that a digital sustainability framework might be able to, in your organization, might be able to help to address. So first and foremost, there's about almost 100% of website homepages have accessibility issues. WebAIM is an organization that does digital accessibility. They ran a 2023 study that showed that basically all pages that they tested had some sort of accessibility issue, which of course denies people with disabilities access to information. Sometimes, which we're gonna address later, this can be actually life-threatening and dangerous. Similarly, there's a digital divide that has happened across the internet that has a bunch of different tiers. First of all, nearly 35% of the world's population still doesn't have access to the internet. Digital illiteracy is significantly higher in marginalized communities. And free tools, while they generally improve access to literacy and information, they also come with other challenges, which I'm going to cover later on in this presentation. Also, more than half of social media users who share news or political posts sometimes do so without verifying the facts. So misinformation and disinformation is run rampant across the internet. Even though 96% of people who are surveyed by a recent study by security.org do want to limit the spread of false information across the internet, it's still a pretty significant problem and undermines democracy, social structures, etc. Next, security, about 60% of web pages have security issues, known security vulnerabilities. Hackers exploit security vulnerabilities, which can put personal data at risk. And it also can obviously cause website hacks and websites to go down, and can lead to lawsuits and significant fines if there are data breaches. And finally, which I think you can't talk about sustainability without talking about emissions. The internet is a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions. The numbers rise exponentially year over year as our appetite for data and technology grows. Yet, despite this, very few organizations actually prioritize digital emissions in their climate action plans, which is one of the things that we're going to talk about today. So, as a B Corp, we try to use our skills to address these issues, especially since we build the internet for a living, or at least parts of it. And so that led us to the question, how might we make the internet more sustainable for people and planet? And as I said earlier, our B Corp assessment, we went through it for the first time in 2011, and we thought we were doing really well in one area of the company, and the B Corp certification is so rigorous that it really helped us take a magnifying glass to every element of the business. And right about the same time, there were being a lot of reports coming out about the environmental impact of the internet and what could be done about it and that kind of stuff. And so we wanted to make sure that what we were doing was directly trying to help or address that issue. So that being said, digital sustainability includes an organization's entire digital infrastructure, including your policies, your practices, hardware, software, data centers, even the printer down the hall. But that's a big picture thing, and given that we only have 45 minutes here to talk about this topic, let's just start with what we can change, which for most organizations is your website. Every organization has one, so that's a good place to start when we think about digital accessibility, especially since there are over 2 billion web pages on the internet. So if every organization with a web page or a website actually focused on prioritizing digital sustainability, we could actually make significant change happen across the internet. So to frame the conversation, I'm going to talk about what is known as the Sustainable Web Manifesto. And it was created in 2019. It was spearheaded by a London digital agency called Whole Grain Digital. They're also a B Corp. They reached out to digital leaders around the world, including us, to give feedback on what are the principles, ESG principles, specifically environmental, social, and governance principles that the internet should have moving forward. And we put a whole document together and collaborated on it and came up with these 6 simple principles helping to address the internet's growing sustainability issues. And those are, as you can see in the little red box over on the right-hand side of the screen: clean, efficient, open, honest, regenerative, and resilient. So I'm going to use those 6 principles to kind of frame the rest of my presentation and talk a little bit. We'll go high level and talk about what the principle is, and then I'll break it down a little bit about why it's important and what you can potentially do within your organization on this. So without further ado, let's go on to the next one. First one, that is clean. Services we provide and use should be powered by renewable energy. So making sure that you're powering your digital products and services with renewable energy. The simplest thing is to probably go to a web host. We're focused on websites for this presentation, but again, also consider other digital infrastructure that your organization owns and maintains. To do this, I want to talk a little bit about where emissions come from on the internet. These numbers are based on a 2020 academic study by a man called Anders Andre. In his study, he estimated that the internet uses roughly 2,000 terawatt hours of energy each year, and that basically that energy is split up between 4 system segments, if you will. So network use, data center use, consumer devices, and then the embodied energy that's used to make hardware like iPhones and software or hardware chips and servers and that kind of stuff. And so as you can see from this screen, it's broken down by those 4 categories. Each category plays a different part. There's been some pushback on some of these numbers. And as you can probably imagine, it isn't easy for your average organization to get data on these things. You might be able to find out how much green energy your web host uses, for instance, if you reach out to them. But generally, this information isn't readily or publicly available, which makes tracking digital emissions quite challenging. In terms of how they fall into like digital kind of standard reporting frameworks like GRI and stuff like that, scopes 1 and 2 are pretty basic, pretty cut and dried. It's fuel use, fugitive emissions, purchased electricity. That kind of applies across your organizations, including whether or not you have your own data center or server room or whatever. Where it gets really interesting is in scope 3. There's 15 categories within scope 3 emissions. Those are emissions that are kind of in your value chain, not necessarily directly within your direct control. But there are 2 of the 15 categories that are really relevant to websites and digital products and services. That is purchased goods and services. So like, your hosting account, for instance, or like, content delivery networks. So, so that your website can load rapidly around the internet, or the use of products sold. So, thinking about any products, digital products or services that you've used that are sold, your use of those products sold falls underneath the Scope 3 emissions. So as such, you can probably imagine these things are more challenging to track and manage. You know, and it's in identifying what your kind of digital supply chain actually means. You know, think about like all of the plugins and third-party services you use on your website. For instance, you might connect it to a CRM like Salesforce, or a donation platform like Blackbaud, or you might embed third-party fonts, or you might embed advertising, et cetera. And for advertising, for instance, a single ad campaign can generate about 323 tons of emissions. So if you think about that becomes, you know, rather challenging for any organization, especially for organizations that aren't already, you know, kind of trained up on tracking emissions over time and that kind of thing. So, you know, it's worth noting that Scope 3 is challenging and difficult, and it's still a very emergent technology, but it's also kind of part of this bigger picture of digital sustainability. One of the couple of things you can do, probably the first thing is to get a green web host. There's the Green Web Foundation's a great organization based out of Amsterdam. They have a directory that actually provides a list of green web providers that power their servers by renewable energy. So you might want to consider moving your website over to a host that powers, you know, its servers by renewables. And the Green Web Foundation is a great resource for that. Another part of this is to adopt an emissions reduction strategy, which I'm going to talk about a little bit in the next section. Address scopes 1, 2, and 3 for emissions, and then use only verified offsets for the remaining. Offsets get a bad rap, and they're kind of a challenging situation right now. So making sure that you're purchasing offsets for only the remaining and focusing on a reduction strategy first, and then using verified offsets. Some of the tools that you can use to measure digital emissions, I've listed 4 of them here: Website Carbon, EcoPing, EcoGrader, which is what we created, and then another tool called Footprint. The others are based out of Europe. Website Carbon, EcoPing, and Footprint are all based out of Europe. EcoGrader is home in Chicago. There are a variety of these tools available. Most of them calculate emissions based on kind of broad estimates of that system pie chart I shared earlier, and they're usually based on like the kilowatt hours measured per gigabyte of data transferred, which means there are gaps in their data. And so if you want to kind of fill in those gaps, you can run a digital life cycle assessment, which is more comprehensive, but also more challenging and more probably costly as well. So that was principle 1. 5 more. Hope you're still with me. I know that was a lot of information in 4 short slides. The next Sustainable Web Manifesto principle is efficient. The products and services that we will use the least amount of energy and material resources possible. So this is really about efficiency and you know, reducing the amount of data used, the amount of electricity used when you do things like redesign a website. Efficiency is a core part of all sustainability frameworks, and so here's how it applies to digital sustainability. This is a quote. Tom's company, Whole Grain Digital, created Website Carbon. It was the first carbon calculator on the internet that does page-based digital carbon calculation. It's really important to remember that digital is physical. Virtual data uses real-world resources like water, electricity, you know, hardware, all of this kind of stuff, rare earth minerals, etc. Just because something is in the cloud, and I'll use air quotes there, doesn't mean that we necessarily don't have to think about it. You know, I think we've all been kind of trained that something is in the cloud, and so it's really someone else's problem or something that we don't have to think about. And you know, prioritizing digital efficiency can help us, you know, understand the impact of where our various impacts or emissions are and the resources required, and then collectively reduce digital waste as part of that process. So for instance, many web pages are much larger than they need to be. The average web page, according to the HTTP archive, which kind of tracks how the web is built, is about 2.3 megabytes. There are a lot of web pages that are smaller. There are a lot of web pages that are much larger. Optimization practices prioritize efficiency. So it is possible to get that 2.3 megabyte size down. And that may not seem like a lot, but remember, again, there's over 2 billion pages on the internet. And if each one of these pages, let's say it just kicks out a gram of carbon or a gram of emissions, some of these pages get millions of views, page views a month. And so that all kind of adds up. And so there's, once you start to peel back the layers of the onion, it's really a kind of complicated and potentially big impact. It is also, more than anything, crucial to good page performance. I mean, we all want to have websites that meet the needs of the people who use them. And so optimizing efficiency on your web pages is also going to lead to happier users and better user experiences as well. So in order to do this, do things like optimizing images, video, code, etc. So some of these things like the images, optimizing images, it's just a matter of literally going in and saying, is this image as small as it can be while still maintaining quality? That might be something you can do without the help of a digital agency or a web developer or something. But then there are also ways to actually minify and reduce the impact of your code and other elements on a web page. Another thing to do is to set performance budgets. So let's say, I mentioned on the last screen, 2.3 megabytes is the average web page size. Let's say you want to be half that size. So, let's say you want to be you want to keep all of your pages underneath a megabyte. So set a performance budget and connect with your team and discuss with your team what that means. And so if we want to max out all of our pages at a megabyte, what does that actually mean in terms of meeting our goals? In terms of user experience, many of us have been guilty of creating forms, for instance, where you ask for far too much information. In fact, we collect way more data than we ever need. And so from a user experience perspective, if you can reduce the number of fields in your forms, reduce the number of steps in a task you hope a user to take, like making a donation or something, just kind of streamlining those processes, every little bit helps there, and again, provides a better user experience. The screen grab on the right there is from a resource called sustainablewebdesign.org. Mighty Bytes created this resource with Whole Grain Digital in London. And the idea is it just kind of helps you give a basic overview of the sustainable web design kind of practices and principles. And so anybody can use it, and I'll talk a little bit more about how it's going to evolve a little bit later on. And then I mentioned EcoGrader earlier. We built it specifically to help organizations with these issues, with these efficiency, reduce emissions, improve performance, and improve efficiency. EcoGrader is free for anyone to use. Anybody can put any URL in. Our purpose for creating it was to create a simple educational tool that helps people understand this concept in an easy way that will be meaningful to a business owner or an organizational leader, but also tactical for web developers and web designers to actually be able to roll their sleeves up and change some of these numbers and fix things. And then I think it's also worth mentioning we have a very dysfunctional relationship with data in our society currently. And so, most organizations are terrible at efficiently managing data. Up to 90% of the data organizations collect typically goes unused. And so that kind of makes today's data centers basically virtual landfills of information that is not needed. And every single byte of data requires electricity to run. So, we advise for organizations to devise a data disposal strategy so that you're only collecting and working with the data that you need, and focusing on quality. You probably don't need more data, but you probably need better data. So figuring out what that actually means. And then generally just adopting more sustainable data strategies. We have a resource on the Mighty Bytes blog specifically about how to adopt a sustainable data strategy. And I'm happy to share this whole deck with everybody in it. It's got lots of links and lots of resources, so happy to share that after we're done here. The third principle is open. The products and services will be accessible, allow for the open exchange of information, and allow users to control their data. So open access, open source, open data, et cetera. These are all critical concepts for climate justice and an equitable internet. This probably falls more under the S of ESG, environmental, social, and governance. but it's really important because advancing climate disclosure legislation for better data transparency can help us fill in those gaps that I mentioned earlier in the sustainable web design methodologies for calculating emissions. Plus, generally, just open everything, and transparency around this stuff is really important to making sure that you can share as much information as possible and get everybody up to speed. So in order to, actually, tactically do something about that, we recommend prioritizing web accessibility. The World Wide Web Consortium's Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, also known as WCAG, they give open and inclusive access to information. And so at Mighty Bytes, for instance, we target WCAG level AA for all web content on every project that we do, making sure that every website that we launch is perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Also, we recommend using open source tools and methods. Mighty Bytes is a WordPress shop. We use an open source CMS. We have a lot of open source tools. We follow the open source way as guidelines for kind of digital trust, digital transparency, collaboration, inclusion, community building, et cetera. And then, data transparency, share what you learn as you learn it. Put things out there in open, Creative Commons licenses and some similar things. And in terms of privacy, making sure that you respect data privacy and ownership. This is a relatively emergent topic. GDPR has been around in Europe for a few years. I'm sure Canada has some similar legislation. California in the United States has legislation, and there's various legislations in states of disarray, if you will, in various United States. The point is, though, however, there are some really major fines. Just earlier this week, Facebook was fined $1.3 billion US for violating privacy. So that throws down the gauntlet to say, hey, sure, they're going to go after the big ones like Facebook and Google first. However, this is the law in many places, and so making sure that you're respecting personal data privacy, respecting data ownership, giving people the right to be forgotten. For instance, if they want to be removed from your list, you have to remove all of their data, not just unsubscribe them, etc. We have a data privacy checklist on the Mighty Bytes website that kind of just breaks down what these things are and what you can do, and that can potentially help as well. All right, next one, honest, is products and services will not mislead or exploit users in designer content. I mentioned misinformation and disinformation earlier. There's a case to be made for due diligence around this. My hunch is most nonprofits aren't going to willfully mislead people or users, but it is easy, to accidentally share things that aren't true. And so there's a lot of due diligence that needs to happen around this. Some examples of this, not necessarily just on the content side, but also on the design side. There's a thing called dark patterns, also sometimes known as deceptive design, which are interfaces intentionally designed to trick users or trick people. So examples might be sneaking a product into a shopping cart, content ads disguised as content, hidden fees and checkouts processes. These things are all over the internet. Call them out when you see them. Make sure that people are aware of them. One big example, for instance, is try deleting your Amazon account. One would think, for instance, that would be super easy to do, and it's actually a really, really, really complicated, challenging process that has many, many steps and intentionally dissuades people from deleting their account. Misinformation, as I mentioned, is accidentally sharing, untruthful information. Disinformation is intentionally doing so. The whole point is to make sure that you're being vigilant about that and calling it out whenever you see it. And then finally, avoid greenwashing by enacting organizational policies before making climate claims. I think that's a big thing that many organizations, even good-intentioned ones, even lots of B Corps do, is they'll make a lot of climate claims or green claims without actually living the story before telling the story. And so it's really important to kind of, in your communications that you're calling this stuff, out and being truthful and transparent about it. And in terms of, I just mentioned policing mis and disinformation. Also want to improve user experiences to build trust. So the opposite of dark patterns might be something like green fat patterns, or, just good user experience. Make it fast, make it easy for everyone to understand and use, make it work across devices, platforms, in low bandwidth areas. Not everybody has a broadband connection everywhere they're at. With assistive technologies, for people with disabilities, et cetera, just making a good user experience across the board is really critical for building that trust and building that honesty. And then finally, engaging in advocacy. We need better climate and tech legislation to promote these practices and principles. As nonprofits, you're probably all engaged on some level of advocacy. As B Corps, we're regularly trying to engage in that work as well. It's important for everybody to get engaged in that and make it a priority. The fifth principle of the Sustainable Web Manifesto is regenerative. So products and services will support an economy that nourishes people and planet. So this is really about, like, what is it you're promoting? What is it you're actually selling? What is it you're actually supporting? Oftentimes, I mentioned this earlier, free products and services improve access, but they also have a lot of hidden costs in terms of privacy, surveillance capitalism, kind of the data that they generate and that kind of stuff. Also increases tech monopolies and fuels inequality as well. So we have to ask ourselves, does supporting companies with questionable data harvesting practices really enable the kind of future that we all want? Another example of this is e-waste. There's millions and millions of tons of it every year, and less than 20% of it is recycled. It's a huge problem. So doing things like, supporting right to repair legislation and buying refurbished materials or hardware is really important. Generally, in terms of things to do, buy from ethical companies committed to doing good, those that are paying a living wage, otherwise sharing in their economic benefits, things like B Corp, social enterprises, that kind of stuff, to support the impact economy overall. I mentioned planned obsolescence drives e-waste, so buy refurbished when you can, support right to repair legislation, and then, of course, no organization can do this alone. These are big issues with many hurdles and gaps, and so create strategic cross-sector partnerships and alliances based on shared values and this idea of continuous improvement. We're not going to get there. We're not going to solve climate change by next Tuesday. We're not going to solve all of the hurdles in digital sustainability anytime soon unless we kind of join together and share knowledge and practices and focus on this idea of continuous improvement. Finally, the last one is resilient products and services will function in the times and places where people need them the most. As disruptive climate events become more and more frequent, access to information becomes increasingly critical. So the examples that come to mind include things like healthcare information, evacuation routes, location-based resources, available volunteers, network coverage, all these things. Those things should be readily available. And when they're not, bad things can happen. See the previous point about access to information. So one of the reasons it's important, bad security and poor data practices put personal privacy at risk. If you've experienced a hacked website, for example, you know how disruptive it can be. In addition to interrupting business continuity, hacks can also cut off access to important information, like I mentioned earlier, and also cause data breaches. And the result of data breaches can often be lawsuits, fines, et cetera, that kind of stuff. And so, it's a kind of a snowball effect when it comes to, oh, I just didn't pay attention to my website and it got hacked, to all of a sudden, like, oh, now I'm being fined because we accidentally breached donor data or something like that. So good organizational governance often leads to good digital resilience. Impactful organizational policies and practices improve this. Security, accessibility, privacy, maintenance, capacity, governance, all these things play a role in good digital resilience. And oftentimes they're at an organizational level, so they're interdepartmental and multidisciplinary. So you might have to train your teams to build capacity or create multidisciplinary task forces within your organization in order to create sustained success. Some of the things to do: implement digital maintenance and governance plans. Neglecting digital products increases risks and costs, so making sure that you're keeping your software up to date. You're mindful of potential security vulnerabilities. I would say, honestly, as a digital agency that's been around for a while, this is probably the most common issue that we see with nonprofits, is the ability that the website just kind of gets shuffled to the side and neglected, and then the software goes out of date, and then there's a security vulnerability, and then some wily hacker finds that vulnerability, and things kind of spiral out of control. So we always advocate for organizations to, whenever possible, focus on things like continuous improvement, so that you're always spending a little bit of time and you're continuously maintaining your products and services, and then also cross-training teams to maintain them, maintain the processes, the practices, and generally just build capacity. We also have a digital resilience breakdown, kind of a really comprehensive breakdown on our website, and we collaborated with TechSoup on one as well, which I'll talk about in a minute. Speaking of which, now I'm going to just share, those are the kind of 6 main principles. I know it was a lot underneath each principles. The principles are pretty big. There's a lot of things you can do underneath each of them. But I do want to share, before I close this presentation down, share some resources that can help you dig deeper into the topic or learn a little bit more. First one is, there's a few books out there, one of which I wrote, Designing for Sustainability. Also Sustainable Web Design by Tom Greenwood, and Sustainable Web Design in 20 Lessons by Michael Anderson just came out, I believe, like a month ago or 6 weeks ago. So it's relatively timely. Chiara mentioned in the introduction that there is a World Wide Web consortium group that's working to you take the lessons learned from accessibility. World Wide Web Consortium defined the most commonly used web accessibility standards, and now this community group within the W3C is hoping to do the same for web sustainability. And I can share a link on how to join that community group, and then we also have some information about why it's important on our blog. But the idea is we've already created 150 pages worth of guidelines, and the idea is to share those openly and outwardly, and get feedback from all kinds of organizations on how to improve them, with the idea that eventually we'll get to a set of standards similar to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And then we did work on a digital sustainability series with Chiara at TechSoup. You can find the series at techsoup.ca. There are 6 articles focused on topics covered in this presentation, and I believe Chiara is going to link to all of them when we post the recording of this webinar on the blog next week, I believe.
Correct.
Great, thank you. Thanks for validating that. Mighty Bytes has been writing about this topic for over a decade now. Like as I said earlier, I wrote a book about it, but we have been continuing to explore this topic on our blog. And there's a great post about digital sustainability, like how to get started today, on the blog. And if you just search on digital sustainability, it will pop up. And I wanted to close with some just acknowledgments of how to support digital sustainability at your nonprofit. All of this stuff relies on good organizational governance in order to be successful. And this unfortunately takes time, money, people, resources, et cetera. And I know and understand that funders typically want to finance programs. They don't want to finance organizational overhead, which leaves nonprofits in a challenging situation in things like this. We see it all the time because we work with so many nonprofits, and I want to acknowledge that that's a challenge, and also invite you to think about innovating within your organization on your business model, finding alternative sources of funding, becoming a social enterprise yourself, or creating strategic alliances to basically help you where you can't, maybe don't have the resources or capacity to do this on your own. And I just want to acknowledge that as kind of a closing thought. Like, this is challenging, it's emergent, it's big, and nonprofits especially are going to be have their own set of challenges to deal with here. So with that in mind, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And I want to know if there are any questions about what I covered.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for such a powerful and rich presentation. You gave us so much to think about, but I can speak for myself, but I hope for others as well. It really felt empowering to learn about all the ways that we can take action on digital sustainability as team members, but also as individuals. So as Tim mentioned, we do have time for questions. So if you haven't already submitted a burning question, feel free to use the tab on the control panel, and we'll keep an eye on it. And we've been receiving questions throughout. So I'll just get us started and see how many we get to in the next 15, 20 minutes. The first question I'd like to begin with is, we were talking earlier, even between you and I, about how there seems to be an alignment between the mission of nonprofits and digital sustainability also as a mission of itself, all the synergies between the sector and this topic, and the impact that is that can be co-generated by embracing a digital sustainability policy. And yet you open by telling us that even nonprofits or the social impact sector that is often quite attuned to matters of ESG, like environment sustainability or social and governance, are not really leading in this space yet. So what do you think? What's the gap there? Is it a lack of knowledge? What kind of barriers are we facing right now?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think the lack of knowledge is one thing. A lack of widespread, like there's been news stories over the course of the past 10 years on mainstream media publications and even in some nonprofit-driven publications around why the internet's environmental impact is a problem, why we have issues with misinformation and disinformation. There's been a lot of information out there. But as I mentioned earlier, a lot of times nonprofits don't have the resources to invest a lot in tech. And this does require time and capacity and kind of resources in order to, to implement it. That being said, there's also kind of no downside to this. You're improving efficiency, you're making your users happier, you're investing in your kind of tech infrastructure, and you're reducing emissions while you're doing it. So, and increasing accessibility as well. So there's, a lot of benefits and advantages to doing it. But generally, I don't think of nonprofits as having, robust IT departments, for instance, or robust web development departments and stuff. And so I would say that's one of the challenges. That stuff is often outsourced, and many digital agencies, I would venture to say probably not the B Corps, but a lot of digital agencies out there do cut corners. They do, that information or that project is outsourced to a digital agency, and the digital agency is cutting corners in order to make the project profitable, in order to get the project done on time, whatever the reasoning is. And so what happens, there's a lot of really great time-saving, kind of templates and things out there. But a lot of times what you save in time, you end up making up for in kind of lost productivity and for instance, an off-the-shelf WordPress template, just use that as an example, since we've been talking about websites mostly in this realm. An off-the-shelf WordPress template, might be easy in that you can get a website up and running pretty quickly, but there's no saying that it's accessible. There's no saying that it's efficient, that it actually performs well, that it performs well across devices, that it performs well in low bandwidth as well as high bandwidth areas, that it performs on an older device versus a souped up desktop machine. And so I think there's a whole bunch of reasons for why this, isn't made a priority. And then on the lack of knowledge side, I think part of it as well is that there's not even the global reporting initiative and the GHG accounting standards don't have really good guidelines for software. Like they have some, if you dig into the guidelines for the GHG protocol, they really focus on hardware, and a lot of nonprofits don't really have hardware and don't deal with hardware. They don't give really good guidance on, software, and they don't at all talk about that third-party scope 3 stuff I was mentioning earlier, where we're all trained to think that if it's in the cloud, it's not really our problem. So I think it's a really multi-layered onion, but I think that that's probably some of the biggest reasons why we haven't seen a broader adoption of this in both the business sector and nonprofit sector.
Absolutely. And to build on your answer, you walked us through some of the environmental impacts of the cloud, and you reminded us that the digital is physical, right? There is water, there's electricity, and ultimately there's waste behind not just the cloud, but all of the internet infrastructure that we've come to rely on and depend on. And one thing that I think is quite compelling and I love among many of digital sustainability is that it gives us one more compelling incentive also to manage our data, right? Delete all files,
Absolutely.
review existing ones. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe a single email has about 4 grams of carbon in terms of footprint.
Yeah, I think it can go up to 50 if we attach an image or something like that. It's yeah.
And that's huge with you. Yeah, if we think about how many emails we send and receive.
Trillions every month, trillions of emails every month.
It's staggering. So what kind of arguments would you then suggest for, say there's like a very keen, interested, committed team member at a nonprofit and wants to bring up this issue to their directors or boards and have them like commit their organization to digital sustainability, starting a digital climate plan? What would be some of the selling points or compelling arguments that could be made to get an organization moving on this front? Because as you reminded us, we also need collaborative efforts. And so it's not up to just one individual or one organization, but we got to start somewhere.
For sure. If you and probably the simplest, so we started talking about this back in 2013, which is when we launched EcoGrader. We launched it on Earth Day of 2013. Nobody had any idea what we were talking about. We got the side eye all the time from people. And we found that leading with the green value proposition, and remember, this is 10 years ago, so it wasn't as much of a compelling selling point to people as the idea of speed and efficiency and performance and that kind of stuff. So if someone is pushing back on the sustainability angle, it's easy to talk to them about the fact that they're going to have happier users. Their stuff is going to work better. It's going to work for more people. It's going to be more broadly accepted. There's a lot of win-win-wins across the board on this kind of stuff, and that it's that some of the simplest things to do is looking at your website. That's probably the quickest thing, because there is like that sustainablewebdesign.org site that I mentioned earlier. There's a lot of simple practices on there that anybody can do to their website, and if they have access to it, they can start making those changes today.
Perfect segue. We started getting quite a few questions about the nitty-gritty, right, of everyday operations and also interactions among team members, because of course since COVID a lot of our work has been decentralized and it's more distributed and remote. So let's start with some of these. Would you have any recommendations for staff that when they need to interact digitally, is there a method that's most sustainable, like email versus a chat system like Teams or Slack or video, or should we think about them as a whole?
Yeah, I think there's a digital declutter toolkit, and I'll try to include it in this deck, so that when you share the deck out, there'll be a link. Whole Grain Digital created it with an organization in the UK called Business Declares, and it's all about climate emergency. And they really talk about how to think about it holistically overall, about email, about Zoom calls. I read somewhere that turning off the video on a Zoom call can reduce the emissions impact by up to 90%, 95%, something like that. So there are some simple little things that you can do. I do want to be clear about this. It doesn't mean, digital sustainability doesn't mean we have to go back to Flintstones times. We don't have to, these tools are here. We should use them, but we should just be cognizant about using them. And it's important to acknowledge, which is why I brought up the idea of political advocacy several times during my presentation. It's important to acknowledge that, for individual actions alone, collectively will add up, but alone, those are not going to be enough to really turn the tide that we need to turn. We need, massive systems change and that's an overwhelming, idea for a lot of people. It's easier to turn off the video on Zoom than it is to think about like how to change, oppressive systems and stuff like that. So it's just, I want to acknowledge that there's, it is a big road ahead of us, but there are simple things that you can do now with this idea of focusing on, continuous improvement and hitting the bigger picture items as your capacity allows.
And speaking of that, sort of a middle ground, you mentioned the digital life cycle assessment. That might be a way to start today, but keep and hold the big picture in mind, and also work progressively, perhaps, with policies or advocate for policy change. So when it comes to looking at energy reduction or the carbon footprint of a nonprofit, is this the kind of work that a dedicated employee or a team of employees can sort of kickstart and manage on their own, or would you recommend working with a professional? And if so, who are those professionals?
Right. I think so. There's that's a like many of these questions, it's a many layered onion. So I wouldn't recommend doing it first time out of the gate on your own. What I would suggest is finding the resources to work with a consultant, preferably one that you can partner with long-term, that they can basically set you up to build capacity. And that way you can learn and kind of acknowledge what you don't know and figure out what you need to know over time to start getting these practices in place. There are a lot of resources I mentioned out, like some of the things I mentioned on the Mighty Bytes blog, in terms of just kind of getting a basic understanding. But for starters, I would definitely recommend working with an expert. And the challenge there, the other layer, another layer of that onion, is that sustainability professionals and consultants will focus on scope 1, scope 2, and then they'll look at scope 3. It's got a lot more categories than just digital, and oftentimes digital takes a back seat to things like transportation or other kind of product related or service related things. And so you also need to look at your own organization and understand, where do most of my emissions come from? If you're a virtual organization and most of your stuff is done online, then digital is probably where many of your emissions come from. If on the other hand, you're actually responsible for doing Meals on Wheels, for instance, or distributing Toys for Tots or whatever, as a couple examples, perhaps transportation and logistics is more of an impact, and distribution is more of an impact than, say, digital might be. So you need to know those things. Sustainability consultants generally can help you with that stuff, but as I mentioned, a lot of them don't prioritize digital, mainly because I don't think they understand it.
Good point. Yes. And on the sustainable web design front, you showed us the website, and we've put the link in the chat, and we'll link to it again when we share the recording. But we just had some specific questions about that whole universe of sustainable web design. So for example, are there specific programming languages or frameworks that are more energy efficient than others in web development, or in assessing the sustainability of a website? What generally takes up the most data? That could be the first kind of items that are tackled.
Yeah, I can tell you. I can answer both. There are different programming languages that are like, for instance, a static website is going to have a much that just uses HTML and CSS, for instance, is going to have a much less of an impact than a dynamic website which uses something like WordPress or Squarespace or something like that. The challenge on that is that most organizations want to be able to actually edit and manage their content. And so you need to have an infrastructure in place so that you can edit and manage your content, which means having a WordPress or something like that, which does have more of a overhead, more of an kind of emissions overhead there. But you have to figure out where the trade-off is, because if you have a static website, sure, it's lighter and uses less electricity, but it also does, could potentially make it more complicated for your team to update the website content, for instance, if you don't have web developers on staff. So again, you need to look at your organization and kind of figure out where you can make a difference, and then make decisions accordingly based on that. With that being said, I would say undoubtedly the biggest chunk of weight or energy that's used on websites comes from images, media, embedded videos, audio, just generally the code, sure, it uses up some, but generally it's the media that's on a web page. So, thinking about your, big hero images, or a lot of video, lots of websites, and especially, unfortunately, a lot of environmental websites have these big, beautiful video backgrounds on their homepage that show mountains and lakes and, beautiful nature and stuff like that. But some of those can be like, 30 to 40 megabytes, and that's having to load every single time a person loads up that homepage. And stuff, and so there's some challenges with that, but generally, without a doubt, it's images and media that makes up the majority of an impact of a website.
You also showed us the EcoGrader tool, which is such a valuable resource for getting a sense of a website's efficiency score and where it sits in the spectrum of sustainability options. And I'm wondering, in addition to offering scores across different categories, then does it also offer suggestions for following up on those?
It does, yeah. So if you can run a report on any publicly available URL, and then what it'll do is it'll give you like an impact report, a climate report, which kind of breaks down your emissions and gives you some equivalencies about your emissions. But then below that, it'll break down all of the things in various categories that you could potentially do to improve your scores. So reduce emissions, reduce page size, improve user experience, and so it gives a set of things there that you can do that would actually make a difference. And it gives you scores for each of those as well, so you have an understanding of, like, if you're looking at something on a 1 to 100, it'll give you a score of where you're at on a certain thing, like accessibility, for instance, or page speed or page weight or something like that.
Really valuable, and it helps, I think, give a sense of what an immediate first step might be in this broader interactive ecosystem. So if you're feeling overwhelmed or in doubt, one immediate thing that you could do is taking a look at your website and assessing where it's at in terms of digital sustainability, and perhaps following some of those recommendations and working with your team on those. So great, and we're so grateful that this tool exists. So we only have a few minutes left, and I'd like to end with this question. It's a little bit of an opportunity for us to recap some of the resources that you've shared. But we received the question, how can I stay updated on the latest trends and technologies related to green web development?
Sure. I mean, I'm going to be biased, but I'll lead with, you can sign up for Mighty Bytes newsletter because we share all of our blog content there. Whole Grain Digital has a newsletter called Curiously Green, which is great. They break down basically all the most recent, just one came out today, and they break down all the kind of recent developments in the green software world. There is the Green Web Foundation, the Green Software Foundation, just getting on their mailing lists. You could join the W3C community group. That's for people who really want to get in the weeds. It's mostly designers and developers and people who are responsible for actually fixing these things and working on these things in the trenches. And so it can get kind of techie, and in fact I even get a little overwhelmed sometimes. But yeah, that's probably a good place to start. I mean, there's a lot of resources out there that
absolutely. And I'll add, for those who are TechSoup members, our websites, especially our blogs, cover these topics routinely. And as Tim mentioned, we just launched a digital sustainability for nonprofits series, so you can find all 6 articles there, and we'll link to them when we share the recording of this webinar as well. Feel free to follow us on social media. Any updates in this space, we also share there. And not everyone is aware, but we also offer digital courses that are self-paced and accessibly priced, and they cover some of the topics included in today's presentation, including digital resilience, cybersecurity, even disaster preparedness, and having a data governance plan in place. So if you're curious, just add us to your list as well, TechSoup.ca. So with that, that's all the time we have for today. So I want to thank you again, Tim, for sharing your knowledge with us. And I'd like to thank everyone for taking time out of your day to join us.